Thank you very much for joining us today, and I do apologize for the for the latest start. We had to, like, some people, I guess, were looking for the building. So I guess before we kick off our panel today, I would like to actually start with the land acknowledgement. So I'm going to just read the land acknowledgement for University of Toronto, because we are actually meeting today in Indigenous land, and we have to acknowledge the land that we're meeting on. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Before we start as well, I would like to ask the room to stand up for 1 minute of silence as a tribute and honor of those who lost their lives in the Sudanese Revolution. Thank you. I would like to extend our thanks, and on behalf of the Sudanese Canadian community as well here in Toronto, to the University of Toronto for hosting this event today, and especially for the Department of Anthropology and the Center for African Studies for their support and contribution to this event. So today we stand in solidarity with the Sudanese Revolution as it enters 7 months of fierce struggle against 3 decades of oppression. As the world watched on June 3rd, Sudanese security forces and paramilitary groups of the National Congress Party and its militias and the Rapid Support Forces, a state-controlled offshoot of the Janjaweed, attacked the peaceful sitting protest camp in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, committing the worst massacre since the start of the protest in December 19, 2018. By opening fire, torching tents, and killing hundreds of people. Credible sources have confirmed reports of people who were killed and their bodies are dumped into the Nile. Incidents of rape and torture, as well as widespread of campaign of fear and violence against civilians in the capital and in cities around the country and in rural areas, such as the Lij in central Darfur. So, according to the Sudanese Physician Association, in the report published on June 12th, 112 people have been killed, including 8 from the Lij in central Darfur. And according to the New York Times and a bunch of other news outlets such as Heavy and BuzzFeed.com, the count of bodies that were found actually in the Nile, there were like 48 bodies. There are more than 600 to 700 people were injured, and more than 70 cases of rape were actually reported. So the historic pre-democracy sitting protest that was at the Sudanese Armed Forces has captured the imaginations of the world and the Sudanese people from all walks of life. The sitting protest was a symbol for the aspiration of the Sudanese people for a new Sudan. The months-old sitting protest forced out a 30-year dictator, Omar al-Bashir, when it began in April. And since then, the negotiations around the government that will succeed him have been halted. So today, our panel will discuss the revolution, what sparked the crackdown, and what's actually at stake in the social and political transformation in Sudan. However, before we actually kick off the panel, I would like just to go very quickly, just to make sure that everyone on the same page, as far as like the major events since the start of the revolution. So in December 19, 2018, anti-government demonstrations erupted across Sudan, initially over steep rises of cost of living and shortages, but very soon they started to call for al-Bashir's steps down. There was a crackdown by the security forces, and then in January 1st, 2019, the Sudanese Professional Association, part of the Alliance for Freedom and Change, has emerged as a driving force for the protests. And the SPA actually issued the Declaration of Freedom and Change on January 1st, which basically has three major parts: the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Bashir and his regime, and it laid out the path to a transitional to a civilian government. These are the signatories of the Declaration of Freedom. Some of them are civil society organizations, some of them are political parties. So if you want to know who is actually involved, we have the Alliance for Freedom and Change, which considered to be, I guess, the de facto body that's basically leading the revolution right now in Sudan. And under that, there is the Sudanese Professional Association. There is the National Consensus Forces, which includes the Sudanese Communist Party and the Ba'ath parties. And then we have Sudan Poll Forces, which includes Umma Party and a bunch of other traditional parties, and the Sudanese Congress Party, and some of the armed groups like the Sudan's People Liberation Movement, the North Side. So the Sudanese Professional Association, it's a quasi-unionist body that basically has a bunch of labor organizations and professional organizations that are basically part of it. So I'm not going to go through the list, all of it, but it includes teachers, includes doctors, includes lawyers, and some civil society organizations as well. And by far is considered the leader of the revolution at this moment. So if, by the way, if you're interested in like any of the information, I will put down my email after, and like I can share with you like all the facts and the details and the structures. We're preparing like a pamphlet like that. I just couldn't print it out today. Okay, so in February 19th, 2019, actually Bashir declared the state of emergency, banned all unauthorized gatherings, giving security forces sweeping powers to squash the protest. But the protest continued to escalate, leading into the major sit-in protest that happened basically at the military headquarters in April 6th, That's a historic event, and it actually led to the step down of Bashir in April 11th. That's when like a transitional military council took over under the leadership of Ibn Auf, and it only lasted for just like General Ibn Auf, and only lasted for a day and so. Which followed by another military coup within the junta themselves, that's led by Abdel Fattah Burhan and his his vice president or vice head of the council, General Hemeti, the leader of the rapid forces. So the negotiation started like after that, and then during the negotiations there were a lot of ups and downs. There was a lot of major events, but people felt that the military council was not really genuine in their negotiations for transitioning to a civil government, and that was the major request by the protest, which basically led to suspending all talks with the military council as of April 21st, and that led to major escalations by the revolutionary forces. And then followed by that, there was a major massacre in May 13, which basically claimed 20 people, according to the Sudanese Physicians Association as well. So after that, more escalations followed. However, it seemed like we were at the brink of actually having a major deal with the military council. The deal was actually structured in like 5 parts. So the first part was basically an agreement for a 3-year transitional period, a fully civilian government, and that agreement was basically was talked about in May 15th. And then we had like a fully civilian traditional legislative with 300 members, where the Alliance for Freedom and Change holds 2/3 of the seats, so they can pass their agenda during the transitional period. And then there was the issue with the Presidential Council. Okay, so there are empty chairs available, so if you are standing up, please come forward. Okay, so basically there was the issue of the Presidential Council, which was agreed to be civilian and military council, but there was the issue basically, it was an impasse issue really in terms of who's going to actually lead the Presidential Council and what are the authorities of that council. There was also agreement to basically have a joint committee to oversee the immediate investigation into the massacres of May 13th. However, the military council actually halted in a very surprising move. They halted all discussions the following day, and basically they since then they started to basically, I guess, escalate on their sides. They asked for the holding the negotiations for 72 hours. Until the protesters actually remove all roadblocks and go back to the sitting area. There was actually a response from the protests, and they did that, but the negotiations after that didn't really come to like a good conclusion, and we ended up with the last massacre event that happened in June 3rd, where basically claimed 112 people and number of other like injured and missing people and all of that. So this is just a quick summary in terms of I guess what transpired that's led us to this point. So I think the next step really for us from here is to dive into our panel discussion. So today we have Professor Khalid Mustafa Madani from Miguel University. He holds a joint appointment there. He's associate professor of political science and also he holds the program director, the graduate program director at the Islamic Studies Institute. And his current project is actually very interesting, the globalization, information, informal markets and collective action, the development of Islamic and ethnic politics in Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia. We also have Janice Bobby. She's a Canadian anthropologist, and she's a professor at U of T, and she's the head of anthropology, the anthropology department. She specializes in medical anthropology, religion, gender issues, and colonialism in Sudan and the Middle East. She is the co-author of Worms and Alien Spirits. Yeah, the author, yes. That's actually yeah, she's the author of she's the author of Worms and Alien Spirits, a man, the story of a Somalian girl, which was published in 1995. Civilian women British Crusades in colonial Sudan in 2007. So she does a lot of work in Sudan, working also like other civil organizations there. We have Dr. Khalid Al-Ajab Ahmed. He teaches at the African Studies program at the University of Toronto here. And his research focuses on the failed peace agreements in post-colonial African states and using the Sudanese state as a case study. And we have also Nisreen and Lamin Abdurrahman. from Stanford University. She's an anthropologist, and her research focuses on the ways the Gulf corporate investments in land are reshaping the social relationships between landless and landholding stakeholders in Jazeera region in central Sudan. She's interested in understanding the social transformation put in motion when different forms of religion and political authority, understandings of Islam and notions of belonging are invoked and mobilized to lay claims on the land. So very interesting projects that the Nisreen is working on. So I guess the structure of the panel, each one of our speakers today will take 15 minutes to basically, I guess, introduce their topic. And then after that, we'll open the floor for participation and discussion. I think, like, I'm open for different ideas. It's very interactive, it's open, it's not scripted. We haven't met, this is the first time we're meeting about this panel, so everything is very interactive. But I think it's better probably to have the discussions maybe after each person provides the topic, and then we'll allow for enough time. There will be some interventions from Mensam. They have like a 5-minute talk. Yeah. So they will be intervening later. There is a 5-minute speech from Mensam. There is a current campaign of Kentucky and White. So they're going to talk about that campaign as well. So I guess without further ado, I'll pass it to Janice.
Thank you. I want to thank Yusuf for suggesting this panel. It was his idea, which began as an information session because we felt that there might have been a lot of people here who didn't know very much about Sudan. It's become, of course, much more urgent since the horrific massacres of the 3rd of June. I want to thank my fellow panelists for their willingness to share their expertise, Khalid Ahmed, and especially Nisreen Alamin and Khalid Medani, who traveled long distances to be with us today. Am I okay for sound? Great. I also want to thank my staff, who aren't here today, but who and my graduate students in the Department of Anthropology for their assistance in putting on this event, arranging the venue, providing coffee and tea, and to Professor Mariam Lo, who is the Director of African Studies at U of T, for providing lovely food. And thanks to all of you who came today to participate with us on a Saturday afternoon where I understand the traffic conditions are not ideal. My address is basically going to outline some of the challenges I think that people who are from the lower or lower middle classes face on the ground, and also maybe talk about why so many women seem to be involved in the protest. It may not come as a surprise to any of us in the room, but I think it was a surprise for the Western media. So I'm a social anthropologist who first went to Sudan as a naive graduate student in 1976. I was welcomed as a trainee into the small Jali village I worked in on the Nile north of Kabushia. I lived there initially for 15 months, being guided by village women and learning everything I could about their lives. My early research focused on ZAR and the way it enabled women to speak back to various sets of powers, colonizers, government officials, presumptuous foreigners like myself, but also to husbands, fathers, mothers-in-law, and other kin, speaking to them through the spirits that had taken hold of them, and doing so in subtle, critical, and often hilarious ways. I spent another 6 months in the village between 1983 and 84, returned for a shorter visit in 94, but then stayed away for some of the more difficult years of the Bashir regime. Even if I had been able to go back and visit my friends, I think my presence would have endangered their lives. But since 2008 until this year, I've been returning annually for visits of a month and sometimes, if I'm lucky, 2. And I was just there for last February 2018. My current research focuses on the same families I began doing research with some 43 years ago, exploring how their lives have changed, and many of these families have dispersed. They've left the village, but return there periodically, in fact several times a year, often for Eid, certainly for weddings and other celebrations, and to visit ailing kin. The traffic goes back and forth, and it's quite a highway. Most of those who left now live in suburbs surrounding Khartoum and Omdurman, in Selma, Saura, Haj Yusuf, Naim. Together with the women of these families, I'm exploring how the short-lived oil boom and new information technologies stimulated changes in their social lives, kindled the aspirations of youth, and reshaped everyone's expectations of what a normal life should entail. The smart, creative, educated, and resourceful youth of these families are deeply frustrated by existing obstacles to their social, economic, and civic participation, a few of which I will sketch today. The economic status of these families can be described as lower middle to middle class, mostly on the lower end. Until recently, however, they were utterly mobile, whereas the older women are non- or semi-literate. Some of their daughters and the majority of their granddaughters have college or university educations. And while not the poorest people in Sudan, most lead lives of considerable precarity, a word that has become common today in describing life in Africa, and especially in conflict zones. Several of these families' daughters and sons, born between the 1970s and the 1990s, also find themselves in a kind of limbo, chronologically adult, but still regarded as youth because they have not yet married. The reasons for this are multiple and complex, but the main problem is economic. They can't afford to get married, or not in a socially acceptable way. They can't afford a nikah marriage, for instance. Many of you here today will undoubtedly recognize this problem. These not-so-young women and men are caught in between, in what Diane Singerman, writing about a similar trend in Egypt, refers to as waithood, as opposed to adulthood. For decades, the families I work with, along with other Sudanese, have placed a high value on educating girls. My friends say that educated women raise smart and resourceful children. The concern for keeping girls in school declined during the first years of Islamist control, but revived after 2005, when the regime relaxed its enforcement of women's deportment rules. There are more universities and colleges in Sudan than ever before, numbering over 60, I was told recently, created as a part of Bashir's civilizing project. And women are attending these universities in droves. I'm not going to suggest that the institutions are all first-rate or that significant barriers to female education have disappeared. Especially in poorer families, a daughter's education may be sacrificed for a son's if resources are tight. Economic sanctions and structural adjustment programs have led to steep reductions in government funding for education, despite the growing number of universities, and an inevitable decline in quality. Few of the families I visit trust their young children to the impoverished public education system. Thus, the number of private elementary schools in the country has grown. Their quality varies, but they are costly all the same. No matter the system, the fees for books, uniforms, school breakfasts, and incidentals that must be privately borne are prohibitive to many. That said, the fleeting oil prosperity of the last decade produced skewed attendance of the genders at universities and colleges. According to UN and Sudan government figures, female enrollment in post-secondary education now greatly exceeds that of males. With increased access to university places and a growing economy until 2012, it was the rare family from the village that did not have a daughter in college or recently graduated, even among the working class. Here, the ubiquitous cell phone has been a contributing factor. With it, relatives feel they can monitor a young woman and ensure she is safe even when attending a public coeducational institution such as the University of Khartoum. Moreover, so few men now enroll in university that coeducation has become almost moot. Students I spoke to at the University of Khartoum estimated that 75% of their classmates are women. Indeed, female domination of post-secondary education is a familiar topic, especially among the Habubats, among the older women. By educating themselves, they say, girls are finding it harder to find husbands. The young women disagree. Most want to work before marriage and are keen to put their educations to use. As for young men, I was told that fewer of them continue to read after high school because they need to make money to contribute to household expenses. Most of them live with their parents or extended kin. There is what academics call a high dependency ratio in Sudan, with 4 persons of dependent age, under 15 or over 65, for every person of working age, between the ages of 15 and 64. Most young men hustle to make money however they can. They do so to help fund their sisters' educations in addition to supplying money for the family, and accumulate savings toward their own future marriages. It can take years of work and family savings to afford a wedding. Many of you must know. Several young men in these families drive amjads or rickshaws, that's unofficial taxis, or belong to a musical ensemble that entertains at weddings. And as you probably know, wedding businesses are numerous and lucrative in Sudan. Some young men work at several informal jobs in order to make ends meet. Thus, more of my friends' daughters than sons have college educations, but few of either are stably employed. Many remain with their natal families well into their 30s, studying, working here and there, or guiding bus, just sitting, or participating in the great economy, distributing goods and services such as cell phone minutes, which is a fun thing to talk about, via their social networks. Unmarried women typically live with their parents or, if they are deceased, with other responsible kin. Not to do so would court disgrace. Sons, married or not, typically live with their parents as well, unless that is, as is common, they go abroad for work. In Sudan's last census, completed in 2008, women outnumber men in every population cohort 20 years of age and over, an artifact of high rates of male labor migration. The government's own, this is a very interesting term, nuptiality figures of those who are married. The government's own nuptiality figures attest to the difficulties of getting married. 30% of men between the ages of 20 and 54 have never been wed. The percentage of unmarried women in this age group is lower, but still pretty high, at 15%, and reflects in part the rising practice of polygyny as disparities in wealth increase in this century's neoliberal context. Highly successful men can marry more than one wife, others can't marry at all. Still, economic, social, and cultural factors do not tell the whole story here. Demography is also at play. Countries of the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, are undergoing a demographic transition owing to declining mortality rates, rising lifespans, improvements to child and maternal health, and an attendant late conclusion to childbearing. These changes in the MENA region have produced a new age structure and a youth bulge where 60% of the population is below the age of 25. The figure for Sudan is even higher. It's more than 63% of the population that is under the age of 25. This suggests that more and more young people will be competing for ever scarcer resources, and some of which will enable them to formally wed, have children of their own, and start fully adult lives. More are going abroad if they can. More of those who stay are seeking and getting educations in this age of global connectivity. And here, women are leading the way. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Sudanese women have long been community leaders, together with men, as well as pillars of their families. There is a lengthy history and tradition of female leadership in the region, going back to the queens and queen mothers of Cushan and Nubia, through to the position of the Haboba, the grandmother, in contemporary Sudan, to say nothing of the strong Sudanese feminist movement from the post-colonial period until today. I want to point out that Nisreen has co-authored an op-ed on this point for Al Jazeera, and we can post the link. All of this flies in the face of popular media representations of Sudanese women, and even those of well-meaning international NGOs. They seem unwilling to recognize that women and men may have complementary leadership roles. But no one who knows Sudan was surprised by the actions of the brave young woman, Ala Saleh, who became the media icon of the revolution and whose image is captured in the poster for our event. I mentioned precarity and neoliberalism earlier in this talk. Sudan's economy began to boom with the development of oil and gas reserves and ensuing exports of crude in 1999. By 2003, neoliberalization was in full sway. Negotiations with the International Monetary Fund had produced a reformed banking system, restructured taxes and tariffs, and, importantly but regressively, privatized social services, including healthcare. Between the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005 until South Sudan's independence in July 2011, the economy soared. GDP grew at over 8% per year. With the global monetary crisis of 2008, expansion waned, yet did not immediately stall. But in 2012, secession of South Sudan and the attendant loss of petro revenue spun the North's economy into steep decline. In 2017, the US lifted some of its sanctions, but this, I understand, was not the boom it was expected to be. Despite a slumping economy, inflation has surged. Friends say that the cost of necessary foodstuffs, such as flour, sugar, and cooking oil, have risen faster than those of other items, at least by 40 to 50% per year, and now even more. Price controls are illusory or non-existent, and wages have not risen to keep pace for the working class. As noted earlier, well over a third of the labor force is jobless, and over half of these are youth between the ages of 15 and 24. Those who work are often underemployed. Although inflation rates began to decline in 2015 with government attempts to increase agricultural production, albeit in questionable ways, as we may talk about a bit later, inflation has risen sharply since 2018 and stood at 73% in December as the protests began. The currency has been sharply devalued. Ironically, throughout the regime, US dollars have been the currency of choice. I say ironic because, of course, the sanctions were US-led. And US cash is particularly valued. Any savings that families have in Sudanese pounds, such as savings for healthcare, education, the weddings of sons, routinely evaporate as quickly as they are set aside. In light of all this, and I'm just concluding, it seems to me entirely understandable that a group of schoolgirls in Accra, protesting the government's tripling of the cost of their school breakfasts, were the match that lit the fires of the ongoing revolution.